greetings and thank you for joining. Thank you for joining and taking time to hear our esteemed panelist about Muslims in Indian history. Since we have limited time, I wouldn't take a lot of time except introducing our esteemed speakers as they asked us to introduce. So I'm a bit uncomfortable, some of it very informal and not complete, but I will oblige as they ask me to. Um, we will have the order of the panel's presentations are first we will have Professor Harbans Mukhia, then Professor Audrey Trushke, and then Dr. Shamsul Islam. I will start with introducing Professor Mukhia. Professor Mukhia has been in the profession of history for 6 decades, retired as Professor of Medieval History and Rector, Jawaharlal Nehru University, also known as JNU, in 2004. It is received the usual national and international awards, that's what I was uncomfortable about, and fellowships that come to a professional. Among his earliest writings was the essay Medieval Indian History in collaboration with Romila Thapar and Bipin Chandra in 1969. Some of his books are Historians, Historiography During the Reign of Akbar, Exploring India's Medieval Centuries, Essays in History, Society, Culture, and Technology, The Mughals of India, French Studies in History, 2 volumes, co-edited with Maurice Aymard, Religion, Religiosity, and Communalism, co-edited with Praful Bidwai and Achin Vanayak. History of Technology in India, Volume 2, Medieval India, edition HM. His essay was there, Feudalism in Indian History, in the journal Peasant Studies, 1981, led to an international debate and journal's special double issue in 1985. The debate led to 2 books between 1985 and 2000, Feudalism and Non-European Societies, editors T.J. Byers and Harbans Mukhia. And the Feudalism Debate. He is the founder editor of the Medieval History Journal published by Sage Publications. With that, Professor Mukhia, please.
Okay, thank you. Um, well, history, as you mentioned, I started teaching history about 60 years ago. So my profession as a historian, student and teacher of history began about 60 years ago. And it was a delight to be a historian by profession. But, it's becoming quite distressful now as a profession because you have to deal with the most absurd kind of assertions thrown at you by totally illiterate people but very arrogant people. Assertions like how do you deal with an assertion like Akbar was like Hitler? This is an assertion made by a BJP spokesperson, a lady, on a national TV, and it's on record. Akbar was like Hitler. Now, if you have to deal with assertions like this, you lose, what shall we say? You lose the dignity of your profession having to. It's very demeaning to have to deal with assertions like this, But that's the kind of thing that is being thrown at us in the social media, on TV channels, etc., etc. And if you deal with it as Audrey would, we know how much of, how much of, what shall I say, almost libelous kind of things are thrown at her in the social media when she sort of tries to meet this kind of stupid, illiterate kind of assertions. But anyway, that's just by the way. We are still in the profession, and we love the profession because it's a very delightful sort of subject, delightful discipline to be in, irrespective of these illiterate kind of and arrogant kind of assertions. Let me, before I turn to the theme that I picked up, namely to discuss how Muslim was the medieval Indian state, or if you like, how Islamic was the medieval Indian state. Before I do that, let me quickly mention that, you know, for about nearly 200 years, we discussed history in terms of, we discussed history with religion at its center. It was a religion-centered history, which was basically given to us by James Mill in 1818, when he divided Indian history into Hindu period, Muslim period, British period, etc., etc. We know that, you know. So that, you know, prior to that also, Islam was present in the study of history, very strongly present in the study of history. James Mill didn't invent Islam as the characteristic, as it were, of an age. But what he did was something very significant. Prior to that, Islam was present, of course, but you know, history was explained in terms of the individual characteristics, the disposition, the nature, the volition, the will of ruler in particular, others as well, but particularly rulers. So you get to see a very weak ruler like Firoz Shah, a very strong ruler like Alauddin Khalji, a very liberal ruler like Akbar, and so on and so forth. You know, so the historical explanation that was given was in terms of the ruler's nature or ruler's will, mainly, others as well, but in terms of human nature, let's say generally. You know, now once historical explanation is given in terms of human nature, then quite clearly, and particularly ruler's nature, quite clearly, every ruler would have a different nature, different disposition, different kind of willpower, you know, and therefore every ruler would behave somewhat differently, you know, so that you get this notion of weak ruler, strong ruler, this ruler, that ruler. So there is a range of explanations given to us. What James Mill did was he anyway in some ways did away with this range of explanations by centering historical explanation not on human will or ruler's will or his nature, but in terms of the religion of the ruler, the religion of the ruling dynasty of the ruler, you know. So the whole period of medieval Indian history came to be known as Muslim period, or prior to that, Hindu period. Why? Because the Hindus were the rulers earlier. Hinduism was the religion of the rulers earlier, and Islam was the religion of the rulers later on. So, you know, a marked shift took place from the history writing in the so-called medieval period, what we know as medieval period, to from a shift from a range of explanations in terms of human will and human nature and rulers' will and rulers' nature to one single point, namely the religion of the ruler, you know, or the ruling dynasty, or the whole period in which these dynasties lasted. So that a major kind of shift of focus took place with James Mill, which was reinforced later on by Eliot and Dowson and many others. So this religion-centered historiography, religion-centered historical explanation was given to, it's a colonial construct, James Mill and later on other colonial historians. You know. In the last 50 odd years, 60 years, post-independence, this religion-centered, single issue-centered, religion-centered historical explanation has undergone a sea change, you know, and instead of this monocausal explanation or monolocal explanation located on one single point, you have it's a very multifaceted kind of history that we are now studying, you know, with various kinds of themes, various kinds of explanations, various kinds of perspectives, a whole range of them, you know. The theme which was earlier Muslim oppression of the Hindu subjects and so on and so forth, you know, and the Hindu resistance, etc., that gave way to a whole range of new themes, you know, the question of ecology, for example, gender relations, for example, the question of the problem of habitats, for example, or family relations, for example, or many things, you know, so that, or even religion itself, you know, the religious practices, the diversity of religious practices and their social meanings, all of these have come into play as a study of, as a part of the discipline now, post-independence, so that the colonial construct of history that had been given to us, which was centered only on religion, that has given way, and we have come a long way from that kind of colonial construct into a very fascinating, multifaceted history with various kinds of themes and facets and perspectives being explored, you know. And of course, lots and lots of new kinds of sources being explored. So it's a very fascinating departure which has taken place. But you know, what's happening now is that we are being forced to go back to that James Mill kind of colonial kind of construct and discuss history only in terms of Hindu-Muslim relations, Muslims oppressing Hindus in medieval India and Hindus resisting. So we are being forced not through an intellectual effort so much as through the effort at social media and patronized by the state, because that's what the state wants us to do. The Indian state wants us to do, to focus on this single issue of Muslim and Hindu relations. So that's one thing that I thought I'll state right at the outside, that we have come a long way from that kind of history, but now we are being forced to go back to that kind of history which we have abandoned very long time ago, about 60 years ago. You know, it happens that you know, I was a student in the second half of the 1950s, undergraduate and graduate student, second half of the 1950s. And it's fascinating for me personally that I have witnessed these transitions that have taken place in the post-independence period. And now even newer transitions that are taking place, newer thresholds are being crossed now in the 1990s and the 21st century. But once again, we are being forced back to abandon all this and go back to that single point agenda of history, namely Muslims and Hindus and so on and so forth. You know, so we must sort of be aware of what we are being forced to do. Now, let me come to the issue that I suggest, to the main issue, namely, was medieval Indian state a Muslim state, or I would put it slightly differently, Islamic state? There is a difference between Muslim state and Islamic state. Muslim state could be governed by Muslims, and it was for a long time known as Muslim state in many ways, not only by James Mill, but by so many others, you know, historians like ABM Habibullah's marvelous book, The Foundation of Muslim Rule in India, R.P. Tripaঠি's marvelous book, Some Aspects of Muslim Administration. Yet it was referred to as Muslim state by major Indian historians. But was it an Islamic state? That's to say, was it a theological state? Was it an Islamic theology which ruled over India through the rulers that were Muslim? That's a question that we'll pick up. Let me say that Islam had a very strong presence, very telling presence in the idiom of the state, what we call medieval Indian state. The armies of Islam is a phrase that is constantly used for the armies of the state. Kafir is a term which is constantly used for the non-Muslims. They were fighting against Muslims all the time, but they were also fighting against non-Muslims, Hindus, and they were calling them kafirs and so on and so forth. So it becomes a ghazi. Every ruler calls himself ghazi. You know, ghazi is a term which is as it were waging a religious war against kufr and so on and so forth, and jazia and so on. So it was in terms of idiom, it was Islam was very strongly present in the idiom, in the thinking of the state. It was also present in the historiography of this period, namely the histories that were written, none, except for Abul Fazl, most of the histories that were written in this period, court histories uh, in the Persian language, they have this idiom of Islam constantly present there. So Islam is present. There is no question. There is no denying the presence of Islam. Strong presence of Islam in the language of the state and its administration and its thinking and so on and so forth, you know. But having said that, the administration that was running the state, the administration, the state did two or three things really. You know, it collected revenue from the land, from the villages. It waged wars against others, and it maintained law and order. That was virtually the three things that it did. You know, its role in economy was there, but it's not the crucial role. So it was virtually these three things. You know, and most of these things, all of these three things were being done through a kind of mixed kind of administration. It was not an administration being run by the Muslims. They were there at the top, but the running of the administration was always through a compromise at the intermediate and lower level, even at the higher level, but mostly at the intermediate and lower level. You know, and secondly, that even though Islam was present, it wasn't a uniform kind of Islam. It wasn't that every ruler who was a Muslim ruler thought along the same lines and did things, uniformly to enforce Islam and so on and so forth, or anything that they did was a replication of the other preceding rulers. In fact, almost every ruler, the point which I made slightly earlier, every ruler did things differently. You know, we know, for example, that Iltutmish, who was among the first rulers of India, Muslim rulers of India, he was asked by the Maulvis to convert people to Islam, and his reply was, "Look, we Muslims are like a piece of salt in a plate of water. You know, so we can't really do what you want us to do. We'll get dissolved in this plate of water if we start trying to dominate it, trying to change it. Alauddin Khilji, much maligned Alauddin Khilji because of Padmavati, which is a work of fiction anyway. Alauddin Khilji is known to have had, it's a recorded conversation he had with his Qazi Muqisuddin. He asked the Qazi once, he was concerned about whether he was doing things with Islamic piety or not, whether he was being a good Muslim ruler or not. So he asked his Qazi, how much time? Give me 2 or 3 minutes for closing. Okay. Uh, so he asked the Qazi, I'm doing this, is it according to the Shariat or not? So Qazi says, no, sir. He asked that, okay, I'm doing that, is it in accordance with the Shariat or not? The Qazi said, no. So that he kept on saying whatever you are doing is not in accordance with the Sharia. And ultimately, in this disgust, Alauddin Khalji said, this is on record, he says, I do what I think is in the best interest of the state. I do not care whether it is in accordance with the Sharia or not. This is what he said on record. And so on and so forth. We know Firoz Shah Tughlaq was slightly more inclined towards listening to the advice of the ulema. Uh, we know Akbar, of course, he launched a completely different perspective on the state through his Sulekul. And Akbar is said to have, there is an English traveler who came just after Akbar's death to India. He came to India just after Akbar's death, and he's recorded a marvelous statement attributed to Akbar. Akbar said, insulting any religion is insulting God. So I treat all religion uh, equally, and so on and so forth. And Aurangzeb, of course, is the much maligned Aurangzeb. He was much more inclined towards orthodoxy, Islamic orthodoxy, but it's not as if he was a Islamic zealot. It's very interesting that uh, in his own time and slightly after his death, the historians who write about him, they are Muslim historians, they are Hindu historians like Sujan Rai Bhandari and Bhim Sen. They are Hindu historians. None of them portray Aurangzeb as a religious zealot. They speak of him as a good ruler, bad ruler, efficient ruler, inefficient ruler, this, that, and the other. But they don't portray him as a Islamic zealot. Even after all his zeal for so-called zeal for Islam, he wasn't really. He was a ruler primarily, as historians have long established, and Audrey has recently got into controversy by asserting this simple statement that look at Aurangzeb as a ruler rather than an Islamic zealot. So that Islam is not the same thing for every ruler. Islam means different things for different things. But finally, let me take up, was it after all this presence of Islam in the functioning, in the idiom of the state and functioning of the state, was it an Islamic state? Was it a theological state? Well, I think there are two strong criteria one could lay down, namely, in any theological state, uh, there would be that state would tolerate only the followers of its own religion. It would not allow the practice of any other religion within its territory. That would be one characteristic of one criterion of Islamic State, like Saudi Arabia, for example, or and Yemen, for example. And second is that only the jurisprudence of that religion would prevail in the territory of that state, Islamic State, or any theological state. Now, none of this is true for India, for medieval India. I'll take a couple of minutes to elaborate the first point.
Professor Mukhia, you have 2-3 minutes at the most.
Okay, just okay. Yeah, I'll finish with that. Yes,
thanks.
Thank you. The first was what was the medieval Indian state, Muslim state, converting people to Islam, Hindus to Islam? Let's keep in mind that the Muslim population of the subcontinent, pre-partition India, is the largest Muslim population in the country, in the whole world. Much larger than Indonesia and so on and so forth put together. But there is not a single book which tells us how did these conversions take place. Book on India, there are 2 books on Kashmir, 1 book on Bengal, but on India there is no book. There is no book because we don't have enough evidence, we don't have enough data to give you a book on the processes which led to the conversion of masses of people to Islam. And that these there is no evidence because there is not enough data, because these conversions took place over centuries, over 3 or 4, 5 centuries, very slowly, very gradually, and at the hands of many agencies for many different motivations. It's not as if the state was out to convert people and they got converted. If that had happened, it would have been recorded both by the proponents of this as well as the opponents of this. But there is no record, and that's why you don't even have a book on the process of conversions. And secondly, that the conversions of the largest Muslim populations are concentrated in the subcontinent, in the north, in Kashmir, in west, in what is now Pakistan, in east, what is now Bangladesh, and down south in Kerala, in the Malabar area. These are the geographical peripheries of India subcontinent, and these were the political peripheries of medieval India. So, and in the heartland of the Mughal, of the medieval Indian state for 550 years, in UP, Bihar, Delhi, East Punjab, the Muslim population never exceeded 14 to 15%. That's, and of this population, there is a very interesting data which we come across. In 1820s, one Bishop Haber came to India and he mentioned that one in every 6 Indians is a Muslim. And in 1941, the last census before partition took place, which told us that the Muslim population was 24.7% or 25%. So that the Muslim population had increased by 50%, from 1 in 6 to 1 in 4 in 100 years when the British were ruling here, not when the Muslims were ruling here. So that the very distribution of the density of Muslim population in the subcontinent violates against the assumption that the Muslim state was converting people to Islam. There were conversions, of course, even at the hands of state, but the mass conversions, as I said earlier, took place over centuries, gradually, and through various kinds of agencies and various motivations. And finally, it was not the Shariat alone which was the jurisprudence in medieval India. Hindus didn't get married and didn't inherit property and according to the Shariat, and Sikhs and so on and so forth. It's only the Muslims who were governed by Shariat in civil law. In criminal law, yes, Shariat prevailed, but in civil law, which governs our life most of the time, it's not Shariat which prevailed. It's everyone's religious codes prevailed. And therefore, therefore, it's a Muslim state, yes, to a large extent, but it's not as Islamic theology, where Islamic theology is the governing principle. It is really paternalism emanating from Sulh Kul. The king is the king of all. That paternalism, which is the governing principle of medieval Indian state. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Mukhia, for that. I really learned a lot. It's a great education, and I am sure all our audience here have learned, and they may have some questions that we can come to later that
Sure.
Ajit will be the discussant. Our next STEAM panelist is Professor Audrey Trushke. She is an associate professor of South Asian history at Rutgers University, New Jersey. She received her PhD in 2012 from Columbia University, and her research focuses on the cultural, imperial, and intellectual history of medieval and early modern India, as well as the politics of history in modern times. She is the author of 3 books: Culture of Encounters, Sanskrit at the Mughal Court, published by Columbia University Press in 2016. Her second book is Aurangzeb, The Life and Legacy of India's Most Controversial King, published by Stanford University Press in 2017. And The Language of History, Sanskrit Narratives of Indo-Muslim Role, published by Columbia University Press 2021. Audrey believes in talking about history outside the ivory tower, and so you can find her on Twitter at Audrey Truschke. Professor Truschke, please.
Thank you very much for having me here today, and a warm welcome to everyone who's joining us. I want to open with a few lines of poetry. These are from the late 16th century Indo-Persian poet Feyzi. Kohe-name ba sad afsun gari, ze hindi beram dar zaban dari. Zadam gam nazare ba dostan, be budkhane dahr Hindustan. With 100 charms, I am bringing an ancient book from Hindi into Persian, the language of the court. I stroll to see with friends the idol temple of Hindustan. As I mentioned, these lines are from Feyzi, who worked in the late 16th century for the Mughal Emperor Akbar. If you haven't heard of Feyzi, you might have heard of his more famous brother, Abu Fazl, who was Akbar's main historian, also a bit of a propagandist for Akbar. The lines are from Feyzi's Mahabharat, which is a Persian retelling of the great Sanskrit Hindu epic Mahabharata. I open with these lines for what they say. I too want to stroll with you, my friends, to see and glimpse Hindustan. These lines also indicate where we might begin, with less commonly discussed aspects of Indo-Muslim history today, such as translations of Sanskrit texts into Persian. Now, Feyzi's Mahabharat was the second of 3 attempts in Akbar's court to retell this grand Hindu epic in Persian. 3 attempts in a single court of the longest book ever written. That signals a pretty extraordinary level of interest in an incredibly long, complex Hindu story within a Persianate Muslim context. And so I think it's fair to pose the question, why? What explains that level of engagement? This sort of cross-cultural exercise was fairly central to Mughal identity as they tried to figure out what it meant to be Indian kings. And I've elaborated this argument elsewhere, but let me just give you a quick summary. As I see it, the Mughals had several sources of heritage. They were Timurids, descended from Timur, sometimes called Tamerlane in English. Right? So they had this Turkish thing going on. They knew what it meant to be Timurid kings. They were also descended from Genghis Khan, so they had a Mongol heritage. I think they were pretty clear on what that meant for them as well. But they became Indian, defined by both the region in which they built their empire, and especially from Akbar onwards, through marriage and other sorts of ties with various Indian communities, especially Rajputs. So the Mughals had to figure out what it might mean to them to be Indian. And translating Sanskrit text was one of a myriad of ways that they tried to do that. Now, this is not the most commonly told story about the Mughals. And really, society's focus on Indo-Muslim rulers has shifted in recent decades. And we just heard a bit about this from Professor Mukia. In the past, people used to want to learn about Indo-Muslim rulers and their role in history. And these days, it seems like more people just want to hate them. This hatred is not based on real history. It's based on a pretty toxic cocktail of half-truths, cherry-picked tidbits, and straight-up lies. And that's where historians come in, at least this historian. I don't like people misrepresenting the past. I take it personally, but more importantly, I consider it to be absolutely antithetical to my professional and my ethical obligations. And those are to research aspects of Indian history, try to make sense of them, and then present that to other interested parties as accurately as possible. So that's what I'm going to do today. Specifically, I want to tell you all about some things that are often overlooked in the Indian past. And then as in so doing, I want to raise questions about how we might think about Indo-Muslim history or Muslims in Indian history a bit more broadly. So let me first turn back to the Persian Mahabharat, because I'm not quite done with that story. I told you about some of the initial translations, what they might have meant for Akbar's court. But what about for later readers? Because there were later readers. In the 1600s, really just a few decades after these various Persian Mahabharats had been created, the text began to be read far outside courtly circles. By the 18th and 19th centuries, there were thousands of handwritten manuscripts of Akbar's Persian Mahabharats all over the place, written and read by Hindus and Muslims alike. There is no doubt in my mind that in this period of time, more Hindus read the Mahabharata in Persian rather than in Sanskrit. Sanskrit is so often associated with Hinduism, and that is fair, but really as an elite language. It was known by a small band of elites in the past, and that's true in the present as well. Now, this sort of widespread diffusion of Persian Mahabharatas, this was an unintentional fruit of Mughal labors. It's not what they intended to do, but it's an important part of history. And this trend of court-sponsored works becoming sort of texts of broader appeal, we can actually see it even more clearly in another set of translations, namely those of the Ramayana. This would be the other great Sanskrit Hindu epic. The Ramayana too was first rendered into Persian under the Mughal Emperor Akbar, and it very quickly became what we would call now a bestseller. There are about 24 discrete Persian renderings of the Ramayana dating from the late 16th into the 19th centuries. Right? People just could not get enough of retelling this text. Now, on the elite side of things, we have some really great manuscripts of Persian Ramayanas still around today. One illustrated manuscript, for example, was commissioned by Abdur Rahim Khan-e-Khanan. He was an Akbar Jahangir period Mughal elite. And I mention it because there's a bit of a local US connection. It's held today by the Freer and Sackler galleries in Washington, DC. So it now constitutes cultural heritage that is appreciated and showcased on a worldwide stage. On the more common side of things for non-elite people, just like with the Mahabharata, more pre-modern Indians, Hindu and Muslim alike, read the Ramayana in Persian as compared to Sanskrit in the 17th or the 19th centuries. This reality, where language is not strictly tied to religion, and interest in an epic story is not narrowly determined and restricted to members of a single religious tradition, this reality contrasts with how so many people think about Hindu culture and Muslim culture as separate monoliths today. But that neat division does not accurately capture early modern dynamics. Now, talking about translations and texts can only get us so far into sort of non-elite people, common folks, what we sometimes call people's history, right? The history of everyday people. And that's because we're still talking here about educated people, right, who could read and write. Now, an emphasis on education and literacy is, I think, fairly associated with Indo-Muslim ruling culture to a great degree. Certainly, it was a direct result of Mughal policies that so many Indians, Hindu and Muslim alike, learned Persian in the 16th through the 19th centuries. Still, we have this question, what about everyone else? What about, say, your average farmers in early modern India? Right, we're all thinking quite fairly about farmers a lot in the context of India today. What would your average farmer in early modern India have thought about Mughal rule or the rule of the various other kingdoms that were around? Now, keep in mind, your average farmer did not read texts. They didn't write texts, and people by and large didn't write about them. So what we have to do is we have to read between the lines. We have to gather tidbits. And where we can't even do that, we have to infer and raise compelling questions. Let me do this by giving you just one example, right? And trying this sort of thought exercise of what might an early modern farmer have thought about one aspect of stuff that was going on in early modern India. And I'm going to give you the example of scorched earth policy. So in early modern India, scorched earth was a fairly common battle tactic, and it is exactly what it sounds like. You literally scorch the earth, you burn it, destroying everything that you can. You thus deny food and supplies to whoever your enemy is. Scorched earth, of course, also causes famine or near famine conditions for everyone else who happens to be around. In the 1680s, for example, we can usefully compare, I think, two instances where scorched earth was used. One occurs in the Maratha kingdom. So Sambhaji, who was Shivaji's successor as ruler of the Maratha kingdom, he burned villages along parts of the Konkan coast, and this had to do with his conflict with the Portuguese who were based in Goa. So he's burning villages. Elsewhere in India, in the same decade, in the 1680s, the Mughals employed scorched earth as a policy against Bijapur. Bijapur was another Muslim-led kingdom independent from the Mughals. The Mughals were trying to take them over. So imagine that you're a farmer or a small-time shopkeeper, something like this. You're living 50 kilometers from Goa or 50 kilometers from Bijapur. I think you would be upset with whoever was burning your fields, your homes, and your livelihoods. Would you not judge whoever was doing this as your enemy, regardless of any shared culture or religious affiliation? One small piece of evidence that I'm right is this. Sambhaji's scorched earth tactics led to defections on the part of other Marathas to the Mughals. Now, some of you might be thinking, we started off talking about stories and poetry and wonderful manuscripts, and now we're talking about burning everything in sight. Like, what a bummer of a progression, right? Not all of Mughal history is very pretty. A lot of it's actually quite ugly. And in this sense, a famous verse comes to my mind. No doubt many of you know this one. Agar ferdos baruye zaminast, haminast, oh haminast, oh haminast. If there's paradise on earth, it's this, it's this, it's this. Now, this verse comes up in a bunch of context, including on the Mughal Diwan-e-Khas, the private audience hall in Delhi. But if we take it as referring to Mughal India, it's not true. Mughal India was not Firdaus. It was not paradise. Pre-modern Indian history across the board was very violent. To be blunt, it was just very pre-modern. Our modern values of human rights and equality, dignity for all, these hadn't been articulated yet. They probably would have struck most early modern Indians as just nonsensical. We really should not be surprised by this. After all, we are talking about the past, a past that is fairly far removed and pretty radically different from our contemporary times. And this brings me to the question of heritage. Heritage is not a point on which I speak all that frequently, but let me offer you just a couple of thoughts about how we might think about Indo-Muslim history as heritage today. First, Indo-Muslim history is the heritage of all South Asians. It's not just the heritage of Muslims, from my perspective. And this is something best demonstrated, as so many things are, by an example. And I'll give you a big one, the Babri Masjid. When a violent mob tore down the Babri Masjid brick by brick in 1992, this was not just a loss for Indian Muslims. This was an act that destroyed part of the heritage of all Indians, of all South Asians, arguably of all people in the globe. We had very few Babur period mosques to begin with. Now we have one less. My second thought on heritage is this: we have no need to justify the past. So a week or two ago, I gave a talk at Aligarh Muslim University. I mean, I was literally sitting here on Zoom, but it was hosted by Aligarh. Someone asked me in the Q&A, how can you possibly justify the actions of Aurangzeb Alamgir? My answer was that I justify absolutely nothing about the pre-modern Indian pasts. Our goal is, as historians, is not to say that the Mughals or anyone else were good or bad. Frankly, I consider it a very boring question to ask, do you like the past or not? There's so much more to know about it than how you feel about it today. My emphasis is and remains, and I invite it to be your emphasis too, how do we understand the complicated Indo-Muslim past? which is so different from our contemporary reality, even as it's shaped our reality. And I submit to you that there really is a pressing need to understand Indo-Muslim history in order to understand our world today. Some of us, right, who became historians, I mean, we just love the past. And for us, you know, we're just always going to be into it. But even if you're not, you need to know something about the past to understand your present. Without it, how would we explain that Persian Ramayan at the Freer Sackler galleries I told you about? How would we explain where that came from and why it matters? How, without knowing about the past, how would we explain the tens of thousands of Persian Ramayan and Mahabharat manuscripts that today are across archives in South Asia and far beyond? Without Indo-Muslim history, how would we explain the Taj Mahal, which is India's most visited tourist site by a long shot? In fact, how would we even explain India's Republic Day celebrations, since that's sort of why we're here today? India's Republic Day celebrations have so often featured Delhi's Red Fort, which is of Mughal construction. Prime Minister Narendra Modi has stood in front of that Mughal monument to address the Indian nation, using Persian words that are now part of Hindi precisely because of Indo-Muslim rule. Without Indo-Muslim history, we cannot understand the very words of a man who espouses such ignorance about his own heritage. And it is Modi's heritage, whether he likes it or not. If we forget the past, or if we try to change it or reimagine it or replace it with mythology, then we risk losing ourselves too. Is not the better way to stroll through the Hindustan of the past and to learn about it, to deepen our own knowledge and wisdom that we might then use equally to better understand the past and to better shape the future? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Krushke. That was amazing. It was literally the journey into the past, and you then brought it back in the present. Thank you very much for that. Our next esteemed panelist is Dr. Shamsul Islam. He taught political science at the University of Delhi from 1973 to 2013. As an author, columnist, and dramatist, he has been writing against religious bigotry, dehumanization, totalitarianism, persecution of minorities, Dalits, and women. He is known for his work on the rise of nationalism, especially religious nationalism, and its development in India and the world. He writes in English, Hindi, and Urdu. He has specialized in investigating the history of the RSS, Rashtriya Swayam Sangh, and its role in sabotaging India's freedom struggle. Professor Islam.
Thank you. Thank you, Rashid Saab. And I must thank first Indian American Muslim Council, not only providing me an opportunity to listen to two amazing talks by two history practitioners, Professor Harbans Mukhia and Professor Audrey. So it has been a great learning experience for me. And secondly, to let me share my views about the role of Muslims in India's freedom struggle. And in fact, I have so much to talk and share because I'll be dealing with facts which were registered in the contemporary documents, for instance, 1857 or later 20th century freedom struggle. So my talk is not going to be even a brisk walking, but running a marathon, right? But I'd be running. So I would divide it into three parts. The role of Muslims in India's freedom struggle. The first part is the 1857, the first war of independence. The first war of independence, and that is where the modern India also comes into shape, comes into being. And all of us know that it began first war of independence, 10th May 1857. And it started because at Meerut, which was one of the biggest cantonments of East India Company's armed forces, 85 rebels were hanged. And in these 85 rebels, 48 were Muslims out of 85. 48 were Muslims, more than half were Muslims. And that first war of liberation of India started. And about 3,000 rebels or revolutionaries marched on to Delhi from Meerut, which is about 50 miles, 60 miles from Delhi. And 11th May 1857, they reached Red Fort. They were not welcome, but they forcibly entered into the Diwan-e-Aam, with the public court. Nobody came to meet them or receive them. They entered into the Diwan-e-Khas, that was the living residential parts of Bahadur Shah Zafar. They wanted him that he should take over the rule. He should become the real ruler, which had been snatched by the East India Company. And mind this, these armed people who are in thousands, 70% are Hindu Sikhs and only approximately 30% were Muslims. And this 70% Hindu Sikhs with arms were forcing a Muslim emperor, a Mughal who had lost all power. His writ did not run even in Diwan-e-Khas. Forget about Red Fort. And these 70% armed persons belonging to Hindu and Sikh religions, they forced Bahadur Shah Zafar to take over the reign of Mughal Empire and become a real emperor. After much hesitation, he agrees to that. So what we need to understand is that there was nothing which we talk about, or Hindutva zealots talk about, that for thousands of years, for hundreds of years, Muslims and Hindus have been fighting with each other. And the other thing is what happened in Delhi, that a nine-member committee was formed to run the war of India's freedom, in which 5 were Hindus. And another very important development was that on 13th May 1857, Azimullah Khan, who was the chief strategist, defense strategist of the rebel army, of this revolutionary army, he writes an anthem for the freedom, Anthem for Freedom 1857. And I'll read it in Urdu. I hope the friends will understand. If you want the English version, I will share on chat. हम है इसके मालिक हिंदुस्तान हमारा, पाक वतन है कौम का जन्नत से भी प्यारा, ये हमारी मिल्कियत हिंदुस्तान हमारा, इसकी रूहानियत से रोशन है जग सारा, इसकी खाने उगल नहीं सोना हीरा पारा, इसकी शान शौकत का दुनिया में जयकारा, आया फिरंगी दूर से ऐसा मंतर मारा, लूटा दोनों हाथों से प्यारा वतन हमारा, आज शहीदों ने तुमको अहले वतन ललकारा, तोड़ो गुलामी की जंजीरें बरसाओ अंगारा, हिंदू मुसलमान सिख हमारा भाई प्यारा प्यारा, यह है आजादी का झंडा इसे सलाम हमारा. It was published on May 13, 1857 in Pyam-e Azadi, an Urdu paper which was being published from Delhi. And then I would like to draw attention of friends to during this War of Independence, and it did not, it continued for 3 years till 1859. This liberation war continued, and joint sacrifices in different regions of the country. I begin with the Ayodhya, which later on became a main friction point and polarizing point, and polarizing Hindus and Muslims. Can you believe what was happening at Ayodhya in 1857? Maulana Amir Ali, a renowned Islamic scholar based in Ayodhya, and Baba Ramcharan Das of Hanumangadi, which is still there, one of very important Hindu sites, Hindu buildings there. They organized resistance army, and they were caught due to the treachery of some Muslim and Hindu princes, British stooges, and they were hanged on a tamarind tree at Kubir Tila in Faizabad, which is now in Faizabad jail. And another example of that Hindu-Muslim unity was Shambhu Prasad Shukla and Achan Khan. These were two leading commanders of Raja Devi Baksh army. They organized a very large army of the rebels, and they liberated large areas of Faizabad and its surrounding areas, and they were also captured due to the treachery of the stooges, and both of them were hanged together. And in order to make fun of the Hindu-Muslim unity, what Britishers did, East India Company army officials did, that they skinned them first. They skinned them for their bodies and then hanged them, right? And another example, every part of India is witnessed thousands of such examples, but I'll just share with you a few. Another incident is Haryana Hansi. Haryana is in west of Delhi before Punjab, and earlier it used to be part of Punjab. There were two friends, Hukum Chand Jain and Munir Beg. They were learned persons. They knew Persian, Arabic, mathematics, and they were also part of the Defense Council, which was established in Delhi under Bahadur Shah Zafar. They also organized large armies of revolutionaries, but they were also defeated and caught due to the treachery of the Sikh and some Muslim and Hindu princes of the area. And what British commander there did, when they were to be after they were killed, they were hanged. That commander said that Hukum Chand Jain would be buried, violating the Hindu custom or Jain custom that he should have been cremated. And what he ordered, that Munir Beg should be cremated, violating the Islamic method of doing the final rites of the person. And the lieutenant who was in charge there, who gave this order, he gave a speech and said that you are so proud of Hindu-Muslim unity, and see what we have done. Now let both of them get their salvation religious-wise. So they were denigrating Hindu-Muslim unity. And then I come to Jhansi, Rani Lakshmibai, we are all familiar. How many of us know that the chief of artillery and chief of cavalry were both Muslims, Ghaus Khan and Khuda Bakhsh? Both of them were martyred. And the day, June 18, 1858, when Rani Lakshmibai was killed at Gwalior Fort, the military officer who had killed her, in his report to the commander, he said that when I found the body of Rani, this body was covered by her PSO Munzar, who was a Muslim lady, personal security officer. So both these bodies were found together. And last I will come to Western UP. Thana Bhuvan is a place. Thana Bhuvan, 11 women of different religions, Asghari Begum, Asha Devi, Bhagwati Devi, Habiba, Mamkaur, Indar Kaur, Jamila, Bakhtawari, Umda, Raj Kaur, Shobha Devi. They organized resistance forces. They got liberated the area of Rudki, Saharanpur, Thana Bhuvan, and many of them were burnt alive. They belong to Sikh families, they belong to Hindu families, they belong to Muslim families. And let me also share the fact that cellular jail, that is Kalapani jail, was established in order to imprison the Wahhabi rebels. And then I come to the second part, role of Muslims in freedom struggle led by Congress, communists, and others. I would again resort to 2 to 3 examples. Jallianwala Bagh, 13th April 1919. It was protest meeting was held because Dr. Satyapal and Dr. Saifuddin Kichlu were arrested, and thousands of Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs gathered in Jallianwala Bagh. And according to the British and Hunter Commission, 381 were killed there, were butchered there. Though there were more than 2,000 who were killed there, but they said that only 381 and 375 were identified, according to the Hunter Commission report. And you would be astonished to know the percentage, the share of different communities, and you will feel proud. Hindus 220, 694, Muslims 61, out of which Kashmiris 14. The Kashmiris who are declared by these Hindutva gang of rulers or RSS as anti-national and patriotic, they are Islamists, but these were 14 Kashmiris who laid down their lives at the Jallianwala Bagh with 375 identified martyrs. Then Chaura Chauri, you know that Chaura Chauri is a place near Gorakhpur where masses people had burnt a police station. Gandhiji withdrew a movement, I believe that was a non-cooperation movement, and for that British administration hanged 19 Indians, poor Indians, and out of it 6 were Muslims. And I'll come to Kakori martyrs, Kakori case. I'm not going into detail of Kakori, but you know that in the Kakori case where these revolutionaries under the leadership of Ashfaqullah and Chandrasekhar Azad, they captured a treasury of the British, not for buying arms, but because they wanted to establish a printing press to publish socialist literature, to rouse masses, Naujawan, working class and peasantry. Ashfaqullah and Ram Prasad Bismillah, out of 5, were hanged on December 19, 27. And Ashfaqullah, few hours before his hanging, released a letter to the youth of this country, and a part of this read, "Brothers, your civil war, your internal bickerings will not be useful for any of you. This is impossible that 7 crore Muslims can be, that time population of Muslims converted to Hinduism. And likewise, it is futile to believe that 20 crore Hindus, the population of Hindus at that time, can be turned into Muslims. However, if you continue to fight, it is easy and very easy that all of them together will continue." And imagine what Ram Prasad Bismillah, practicing Arya Samajis, he said just few hours before his death, his hanging. Government had mentioned that Shri Ashfaqullah Khan is the right-hand man of Ram Prasad. If a devoted Muslim like Ashfaq could be right-hand man of Arya Samaji, like Ram Prasad in the revolutionary movement, then why can't other Hindus and Muslims unite for forgetting their petty interests? And last example I'll give of Udham Singh. Udham Singh wanted to take revenge of the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. He waited for 20 years trying to enter into the England, and he entered there after 20 years. And on 13th March 1940, he shot dead at Caxton Hall, London, Sir Michael O'Dower, who happened to be who was the Lieutenant Governor of Punjab at that time. And when he was arrested and caught, and his name was asked, he said that his name was Muhammad Singh Azad. He did not tell his real name, Udham Singh. And earlier he had written to his friends that if anybody calls me with the name Udham Singh, they won't be his friends. And he said, I have taken this name Hindu Muslim, which includes part of Hindu, part of Muslim, and part of Sikh name. And because he said that Hindu Muslim Sikh unity is required, to defeat the imperialists. Unless we unite, this cannot happen. So these were not only Muslims who were sacrificing, these were also Hindus and Sikhs who were raising the flag of unity of Hindu, Muslim and Sikhs. And the last thing that is role in anti-Pakistan movement of Muslims. May I know how many minutes are left, sir? Rashid sir?
You have 5 minutes, Professor Islam. Is that good enough?
I think
you can go a little.
Anyway,
you can go a little longer. Yeah, we can. We are fine with the QA.
Muslim League announced Pakistan Resolution 22nd, 23rd March 1940 in Lahore. Within less than a month, all leading organizations of Muslims, Shia, Sunni, Hamli, Hanafi, all, they united, they got together and held a conference, Azad Muslim Conference, Independent Muslims Conference, between April 27 and 30, 1940 at Company Bagh, Delhi, in which my Dadaji and my father were a part of that. And the organizations which were there, All India Jamaat Ulama, All India Momin Conference, All India Majlis-e-Ahrar, All India Shia Political Conference, Khudai Khidmatgars, Bengal Krishak Proja Party, All India Muslim Parliamentary Board, the Anjuman-e-Watan Baluchistan, All India Muslim Majlis and Jamiyat Ahle-Hadith. First time in Indian history, for a political purpose, Shia and Sunni organizations had come together. And according to the contemporary press, especially Statesman, which was a pro-British and pro-Muslim League paper, the Statesman, 1,400 delegates chosen from all parts of India, British India and Princely India, they were there for 4 days. And the most important thing was that in that, and unfortunately, forget about Hindutva and others who denigrate Muslims and blame them for being unpatriotic. Most of Muslims do not know about Allah Bakhsh. Allah Bakhsh Sumro, he took lead with these united with this organization. He was at the time Prime Minister of Sindh. That also the Chief Minister used to be called Prime Minister at that time. And he organized, and he was a secular person. He was against two-nation theory. And just, I will read a very small part of his presidential address, which was 2 hours long. He spoke in Urdu. I quote, "As Indian nationals, Muslims and Hindus and others inhabit the land and share every inch of the motherland and all its material and cultural treasures, alike according to the measure of their just and fair rights and requirements as the proud sons of the soil." He is challenging the two-nation theory of Muslim League, that Hindus and Muslims are two different nations. He continued, even in the realm of literature, one finds common classics like Heer Ranjha and Sasi Pannu, written by Muslim poets equally and proudly shared by Hindus, Muslims and Sikhs in the Punjab and in Sindh. To quote but only one example, it is a vicious fallacy for Hindu, Muslim and other inhabitants of India to arrogate to themselves an exclusively proprietary right over either the whole or any particular part of India. No segregated or isolated regions, but the whole of India is the homeland of all Indian Muslims, and no Hindu or Muslim or any other has the right to deprive them of 1 inch of this homeland. Another great thing happened, that a Tarana, an anthem, anti-Muslim, anti-Pakistan Tarana was composed by Shamim Karani Sahab. And I am proud that he was my teacher at his school, Shamim Karani Sahab, and that Tarana used to be sung in all meetings, hundreds and hundreds of meetings of all these 14 organizations used to have joint meetings in different parts of India and also individual meetings. And I read that Tarana, Shamim Karani Sahab, हमको बतलाओ तो क्या मतलब है पाकिस्तान का, जिस जगह इस वक्त मुस्लिम है नाजिस है क्या वो जा, नेशे तोहमत से तेरे चिश्ती का सीना चाक है, जल्द बतला क्या जमी अजमेर की नापाक है, आह इस पाकीज़ा गंगा को नाजिस कहता है तू, जिसके पानी से किया मुस्लिम शहीदों ने वजू, नाम पाकिस्तान नाले अगर तुझको पासे दीन है, ये गुज़िश्ता नस्ल मुस्लिम की बड़ी तौहीन है। टुकड़े टुकड़े कर नहीं सकते वतन को अहले दिल, किस तरह ताराज देखेंगे चमन को अहले दिल। And you must be proud, Muslims who believe in composite India, who believe in composite world. They must be proud to learn about the resolutions passed by the conference. Muslims stand for complete independence. Muslims demand a constituent assembly elected on the basis of adult franchise. You know, Hindutva says that all Muslims supported Muslim League. That's a lie. That's a lie. Only 8% Muslims had right to vote due to the restrictive franchise which was given under Act of 1935. 8% due to, because you had to be revenue payer or you had to be degree holder and other things. So Muslims against partition were saying that you bring in adult franchise and then Muslim League will not win. And they openly rejected, they passed a long resolution rejection of the two-nation theory, and some of the literature they produced should have been taught in Indian universities, in world universities on the against two-nation theory and religious nationalism. But that was in Urdu, so that lies somewhere. And slogan Inqilab Zindabad. Inqilab Zindabad, a Urdu slogan given by Maulana Hasrat Mohani and popularized by Bhagat Singh and his comrades. We should never forget. And this is Maulana Hasrat Mohani, who wrote one of the finest poems in Urdu on Krishna. Mathura ka nagar hai aashiqi ka, dam bharti hai arzu isi ka, har zarra sar zameen gokul, dawa hai jamale dilbari ka, but I am not read that whole of that. And the
Professor Islam, you have like 1 or 2 minutes, if you could.
Last 2 minutes. And you know, despite this history, the Hindutva criminals, you see, I'm very clear about they are criminals, you know. They killed Gandhi, they destroyed Babri Mosque, they believe in Manu Smriti to be the constitution of India, which does not give even right of animals to Hindu women and Shudras. And they say that Muslims are outsiders, Christians are outsiders, they are immigrants. 15th August 1947, their organizer, they came out with an editorial that those are foolish who believe that in India Christians and Muslims will live, and they say they are unpatriotic, they are anti-India and all that. But that is the history कि एक-एक चप्पे पर देश के वो हिंदू मुसलमान सिखों ने अपना पसीना नहीं अपना खून बहाया है, उसके बाद ये बोलो। और इनकी हालत क्या थी, ये क्रिमिनल्स, इनका एक आदमी, I have been challenging since last 4 decades, you give me name of one RSS leader, one RSS cadre who went to jail for even 1 day during freedom struggle, during India's 20th century freedom struggle. And of course, all those Hindu kings who betrayed the revolutionaries in 1857, they were the places, those were the kingdoms where RSS was created, RSS was born. So, my dear friends, I end my thing, and that is a land. India belongs to everybody, as Somru, Allah Bak Somru Sahab said. And if my friends want to know all these things, a book, Muslims Against Partition of India, you can access this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Islam. My apologies, we have limited time. We certainly would like to learn a lot more from you. Thank you for that. Yeah, a lot more from you and our other esteemed panelists, Professor Mukhia and Professor Trushki. All three of you each deserve a dedicated session to learn from you. But as you know, the limitations of time, With that, I invite Ajit Sahi for some Q&A here. We have, Ajit, we have some time, so please go ahead.
Yes. Thank you, Rashid Saab. Thank you, Professor Mukhia, Dr. Trashki, Dr. Shamsul Islam. This was amazing. This was one of the best webinars I have attended during the lockdown of the last, or the COVID-19 situation of the last 1 year. And listening to all three of you, it's just so amazing. It takes me back to my own, very, very amateurish schoolboy reading of history back in when I was in school. And we actually used to learn all these these parts of history when I was in school in the 70s and early 80s. And yet now we have a situation in India where a completely different version of history is being taught. People like Gandhi and Nehru are being removed from history textbooks across India. That's what's happening. We have about 10 minutes to 12 minutes for the question and answers. I just want to, I will have one question for each of the panelists. I'll start with Professor Harbans Mukhia. Professor Mukhia, I want to talk to you on the issue of Babri Masjid. The Babri Masjid has been a defining feature of modern Indian politics for the last 30 years. I used to be a reporter in India for the Indian Express newspaper. I remember covering the Babri Masjid issue. I am myself an eyewitness of the demolition of the Babri Mosque. I was there on 6th of December, 1992 as a TV reporter. I was barely 20 meters from the Babri Masjid. I saw it happen. And I had covered it for more than 2 years. I had covered the Vishwa Hindu Parishad. I had covered the Babri Masjid Action Committee. And the most enduring part of the Babri Masjid Ram Janambhoomi controversy has been that the RSS, BJP, VHP, the Hindus have claimed that this mosque was demolished by Babur or on instructions of Babur, and a temple was built. That's one aspect of it. And the second this temple was demolished by Babur or on his instructions, and a mosque was built. And the second aspect of that claim is that there was a Ram temple and that this is the birthplace of Lord Ram. What does history tell us about it? Can you just take a couple of minutes to tell us about it?
Well, two things. One, almost all historians, including myself, who have done research on this, have published research papers on this Babri Masjid Ram Janambhoomi dispute, the evidence of medieval sources. This is the title of my article, and I wrote in newspapers, etc., etc. That there is no evidence whatsoever that there was a temple, Ram temple or any other temple, which was demolished by Babur. Babur went to Ayodhya. He spent 2 or 3 days there. He went on Shikar. He did some administrative this thing and arrangement and so on. Doesn't mention anything about Ram temple or any temple. Doesn't mention anything about giving an order to demolish it, established mosque. No historian of medieval period, no historian of medieval period ever refers to Ram temple or any temple having been demolished by Babur, and mosque built. So this Ram temple Janambhoomi, this issue began to arise somewhere in the beginning of the 19th century. In the beginning of the 19th century, a popular belief began to grow that this was the site where Ram was born. Now, I don't want to go into details, we don't have the time, but let me say that number one, that no historian has, in fact, every historian worth his or her salt has argued that, and archaeologists have argued that there was no temple which was demolished by Babur. That's number one. Number two, okay, historians can be damned, but what about Supreme Court of India? The Supreme Court of India in its judgment has declared that there is no evidence of the demolition of any temple under the Babri Masjid. No evidence. This is according to the Supreme Court of India. And yet Supreme Court of India gave away the site to the Hindu side for different reasons, but not for the reason that a temple had been demolished by Babur and a mosque was built there. And in fact, they gave a site of 5 acres to the Muslim side as a compensation for having handed over this side to the Hindu side, so that, in terms of historical evidence, in terms of archaeological evidence, in terms of even the Supreme Court's judgment, there was no temple underneath the Babri Masjid which was demolished to build the Babri Masjid. That's, for very briefly, the answer to your question.
I would like to add one fact. Ajit Bhai?
Go ahead, Shamsul Bhai.
See, Goswami Tulsidas, who wrote Shri Ramcharitmanas 40 years after building of Babri Mosque at Ayodhya, he does not mention that some Ram temple was destroyed or one mosque had come at the place of birth of Ram.
So, Shams is not only, as I said, no historian, no Mughal emperor ever refers to it, not even Aurangzeb, who is supposed to be very orthodox. No historian, no emperor, no historian, no poet, Hindi poet, Urdu poet, Persian poet, ever refers to the fact that a Ram temple had been demolished by Babur, Goswami Tulsidas, above all, he makes no reference whatsoever to. So yeah, there is no evidence whatsoever for the demolition. And as I said, even Supreme Court doesn't accept that evidence, doesn't accept that there is an evidence. Yes.
All right. So my next question is to Dr. Trashki. Dr. Trashki, Aida Ali has asked a question. You saw that question. How do you think we regular people could keep the stories of Muslims in Indian history alive and push back on current efforts to erase Muslims belonging in Indian identity?
It is a great question. And, you all have just heard from 3 different historians who have very different styles and sort of ways of approaching the past. So my answer is only one answer. But for me, the key is knowledge. It's education. Because, history is it's not a matter of where you were born or what skin color you have or anything like that. History is in knowledge. And so you can learn about the Indian past, right? Keep reading about it, keep learning about it. And then in terms of pushing back and engaging, I think one key, and I very much try to model this to the extent possible in my public engagements, don't let the other side set the tone, right? They're the foil. They're not, sort of someone that you argue directly against. So when Hindu nationalists say, oh, the Mughals, they were terrible, our answer as historians is on, oh, no, they weren't that bad. That's not what we say. We say, wait a minute, why are we talking about whether they're good or bad and whether you like them? How about we ask some different historical questions? So I know it can be very angering to deal with people who malign your past and who misrepresent it and who will malign and misrepresent and attack you as well. But you cannot lose sight of the fact that we want to be the ones as historians and reasonably minded, educated people who are setting the tone and asking better questions.
Dr. Trashki, I want to have a very quick follow-up question for you. All this history history telling and assessing and examining history was almost always exclusively about rulers and emperors and kings. And what was the situation of average ordinary Muslims and ordinary Hindus in medieval India? Was there conflict between Muslims and Hindus at a mass scale? Did they work together? How did it go?
I'm certainly not aware of evidence of mass religious-based conflict. I mean, even talking about Hindu identity as a cohesive, coherent identity before the 18th or 19th centuries is pretty dicey. I would point out there is a lot of scholarship on more common people's aspects, right? Looking at agrarian economy things, for example. That scholarship tends to be a little bit less sexy, right? People don't like it as much. We don't have as many names or as many great stories, and people were poor, so they didn't produce lavish manuscripts. So some of this has to do with the biases of some historians as well as common people today alike. But there are all kinds of ways to look at the Indian past, and there remain incredible unexplored aspects. And that's another thing I would just point out. History, we want to always progress and get better. We want to know more. Sometimes Hindu nationalists point to changing aspects of how we look at the past as evidence of our weakness. Oh, historians used to think that 50 years ago. They used to think X and now they think Y. They must have no idea what they're talking about. On the contrary, we view change, both changing our prior views and an expansion of our interests, an ongoing expansion. Those are our greatest strengths.
Dr.
Yeah,
Mukhia,
may I-
take that question too.
Yes. Two things quickly. One, that as Audrey said, there is plenty of writing on, this history of kings and queens and their, battles and so on and so forth. That's passé, there's lots of social history of, as early as 1928, I think, my guru, Dr. K.M. Ashraf, wrote a marvelous PhD thesis, Life and Conditions of the People of Hindustan, during the Delhi Sultanate. So there are plenty of work on this kind of thing, But secondly, you asked whether there were Hindu-Muslim riots prior to in medieval India, Well, let me say that the first communal riot, as we understand it today, about 500 of which take place every year under the aegis of the secular state. The first communal riot on record in medieval India took place in 1714, 7 years after Aurangzeb's death. There is no record of any communal rioting taking place in the 500 odd years, 540, 30, 40, 50 years of medieval India. The first one is 1714. Lot of bloodshed, of course, on the fields of battle, but communal riot, as we understand it, did not take place in the whole of medieval India. As I said, and during the 18th century, 5 riots took place, in the whole of 18th century, So that is the record of history as far as relations between the common Hindus and the common Muslims existed. Yes.
Thank you. I will move to Dr. Shamsul Islam. Also, I have a question for all the panelists and the attendees, because there's a lot of questions here. If you are up to, we had a plan to keep this webinar for 90 minutes, but if you are up to, Dr. Trashki, Professor Mukhia, and Dr. Shamsul Islam, we can extend it also, but I leave it to your discretion, your judgment if you want to extend it. It's very late for you, especially Professor Mukhia and Dr. Shamsul Islam. So the question from Brother Muhammad Imtiazuddin is for Shamsul Islam. India is presently very polarized and divided in religious lines. The British sowed discord between Muslims and Hindus. RSS, BJP have been following this strategy. When did this polarization start and take off in India in the 20th century? Can you talk a bit about that, Shamsul, when this polarization started?
See, Britishers were responsible for divide and rule, and every ruler does that. Aurangzeb also did that, and Ravan also did that. So that always happens. But, Hindutva, which is pure and simple Brahmanism. Dr. Ambedkar said Brahmanism only divides. And, we should not overlook the fact that India with Brahmanism or with Manu Smriti as a scripture, which Savarkar says that after Vedas, that is the most important scripture for Hindus. You do not need Britishers to divide India. They had been doing it. And today, coming to power using the infirmities of the Indian election system, they feel this is the last chance they could secure votes, and they are doing what Brahmanism or Manu Smriti has decreed for them.
All right. Okay. So there is a question here. What are and I would like to, Dr. Trashki, because you said that you have extra 10 minutes. What are the most effective means that can be employed to counter the poisonous and motivated reinterpretation of Indo-Muslim history? And you did answer partly this question earlier by saying knowledge and leave it to the historians. But what can be done by the civil society at large? How do you counter the poisonous and motivated reinterpretation of Indo-Muslim history? This question comes from Hassan Ghayas.
So I think events like this are very helpful you know, when it's a bunch of historians in the ivory tower, seemingly speaking against large groups of people outside, that doesn't tend to look so well. So events like this are very helpful because it suggests that there are other ways, even beyond historians and people who are interested in a sort of more honest pursuit of historical knowledge. I think also coming up with other narratives, right? So if we don't like the Hindu nationalist story, not just because we don't like it, but because we don't think it's correct, we don't think it's accurate, well, then what is our story? And we have to contend with historians against the sort of, in my opinion, the unavoidable reality that it might not be as compelling of a story, right? There's no grand Indian narrative that I can honestly pitch against the grand Indian narrative of Hindu nationalists, but that doesn't mean I'm not going to try to come up with a variety of different kinds of stories.
Right. So here's a question that I would like you to take and if Professor Mukhia wants to, also answer this question after you've spoken. This is the first question by Shashwat Bhattacharya. He says, though it is tried to consider that Alauddin Khilji and Muhammad bin Tughlaq were conservatives, but actually they were the ones who cut down the power of the ulamas and moved away from the Islamic State, even as Sultan Mubarak Khilji considered himself a Khalifa. So in the way, how much Delhi Sultanate was an Islamic state? I mean, I can see that Shashwat Bhattacharya is a student of history, so he's asking this question. How much Delhi Sultanate was an Islamic state? And secondly, if we follow Richard Eaton, he has pointed out a fact that none of the rulers of Sufis considered themselves as Ghazis, though R.C. Majumdar had tried to show, but no record was there. How do you see these facts? So can you also simplify this for us? Even for me, it's a little difficult to understand this question, but it seems like an important question.
Yes, okay.
So can we start with... Okay, Professor Mukhia, you go first.
Okay, if you like. Yeah, okay. In some ways, Delhi Sultanate sort of imaged itself as the title the early sultans used for themselves was Nasir Amirul Momineen, helper of the leader of the Muslim community. Nasir Amirul Momineen. Not the Amir himself, not the head himself, but his assistant, So they portrayed themselves, the early one, But in 1258, the Khilafat itself had been abolished, had been rolled up by Hulagu Khan. So, they no longer called themselves Nasir Amirul Momineen, but early sultans did. So they did image themselves. Their self-image was that of serving the millat, the Muslim community, but that's one of the formats, you see. But in reality, this gentleman who asked this question mentioned Alauddin Khilji and Muhammad Tughlaq and so on and so forth. It's not only Alauddin Khilji and Muhammad Tughlaq. Alauddin Khilji, in fact, I gave you one example of his, but about his conversation with Qazi Mughisuddin. But Alauddin Khilji said he had conquered a lot of, he had conquered Gujarat and conquered a good part of Rajasthan, established himself and Devgir, etc., established a large empire. And then he was contented. Then he asked he had a great advisor, the Kotwal of Delhi. He said, Prophet, I have done enough for conquest of territories. Now, Prophet Muhammad had 4 very faithful companions, and he established Islam as a religion and became immortal for the rest of history. I also have 4 companions, very faithful companions. Shouldn't I also go out and establish a new religion for my, of my own, and leave the administration to my sons and so on and so forth, So his Kotwal, Alaul Mulk, he said, Your Majesty, establishing a new religion is not a matter of having companions, It's a question of God wanting you to, etc., It's a God's inspiration and so on. So he was dissuaded from doing that. But, it shows what kind of attitude he has towards Islam, that because Prophet Muhammad had 4 companions, so he established a new religion. So can I can also be a Muhammad, So, that kind of attitude of Alauddin Khilji and Muhammad Tughlaq was supposed to be a rationalist. That was one of the accusations against him. So that none of these. Firoz Shah Tughlaq, to some extent, as I mentioned earlier, listened to some extent. He demolished one temple, Jwalamukhi. But is none of these rulers, whether in Delhi Sultanate or in the Mughal Empire, were actually guided by the ulama and their advice. They took their advice and very often ignored it and did a bit of it. So there are two aspects of it. One is that there is an early Delhi Sultanate self-image of being Nasir Amirul Momineen, but the reality of politics is that it has very little to do with the enforcement of Shariat or spread of Islam in the country.
Right.
That it has very, very little to do that effectively.
Quickly, do you want to also attempt that question? Because I have another question for you before you go.
Let me say a couple of things briefly. So when you ask whether a particular state or sort of succession of dynasties really was Islamic, it really depends to me how you define Islamic and who you allow to define it. And Professor Mukia gave certain ways of defining it that I think are totally fair and useful. Thinking, from the perspective of the Delhi Sultanate, for example, when you have somebody like Alauddin Khalji going up against the ulama, and most Indo-Muslim rulers butted heads with the ulama at some point, like the ulama were a major pain for all the kings. Who gets to say what was Islamic? Does the king or do the ulama? And if we really, I think most people probably answer that question, the ulama, but why? Why do they get to say any more than a particular ruler does? And I think you can start to get into there some of our modern day assumptions about religion and who gets to define it more than other people do. In thinking about terms like Ghazi and jihad, in the armies of Islam, Professor Mukia is 100% correct, of course. This stuff is all over text from a variety of different rulers. And key to understanding it is being able to distinguish rhetoric from reality. When I teach students about this, some of them will occasionally get frustrated. Like, professor, I have to learn all these new names and dates and all these people. And then you're telling me that the text they wrote, I can't even believe them. And I understand it's frustrating, but just because someone wrote it down 600 years ago doesn't mean it's true. And to drive the point home of how awful it would be if we were to misinterpret political statements as reality, I sometimes give students, keep in mind I'm teaching in the United States, I give them the example of Trump's tweets. Imagine that hundreds of years from now, historians read all of Donald Trump's tweets for the 4 years he was president, and they just take it seriously. Oh, that's just how it was. You would be in such a fantasy, this, a nightmarish landscape, and you would miss it. You would miss the real history of America for the last 4 years. And so with the Delhi Sultanate, as frustrating as it is, you can't just because someone wrote it down in a historical, what we now call a historical text, you can't take it seriously. You have to read critically.
So I have a couple of very important questions for Dr. Shamsul Islam. But before that, I just want to stay with Dr. Trashki. And I am a layperson. I'm by no stretch of imagination can I lay claim to more than a very cursory understanding of history as a journalist. And it has been said that journalists are the first chronicler of history. And people like me who are amateurs who love that kind of statement. Of course, you guys are
Ajit, you are lying.
No, you are the gurus, and you are the gurus. And listening to people like you, it moves my heart, and I'm sure the more than almost 200 people who joined the webinar today. What the RSS narrative has been, it's basically broken into 3 blocks. One is that India was pure Sone ki chidiya, the golden bird in its some kind of remote past. Then came the Muslims, and it was truly the dark period. And then, of course, the day Mr. Modi became prime minister after his swearing in 2014, May of 2014, I don't know if you remember, but I was watching it live on TV, and he said, we have finally found freedom after 800 years.
And yes,
on the day he became prime minister. So he was discounting the first 65 years of India's freedom and, the various prime ministers. Now, my question to you, Dr. Trashki, is this whole approach to describe the Muslim period, the so-called Muslim period of Indian history, as a black period, as a dark period, as a period of invasion, of subjugation, of mass atrocities, mass killings, hundreds of millions were killed. That's a kind of history. What is the social influence in terms of language, in terms of social mores, cultures, dressing, food? The India that we know today, how much of that India draws from that period? Or is it today's India has actually, now gone back to being the Hindu India that used to be before the Muslims invaded and corrupted this land, quote unquote?
That's a huge question.
It is.
So to the extent that Modi and other BJP members have espoused this idea of some sort of turning back the clock to a more virtuous time, that's what we call bullshit, to use a technical term. They're not turning back anything. They're instituting a sort of form of fascism that only makes sense in modernity. I mean, fascism is definitionally a modern thing. There's no going back in history, right? I mean, you may have traces from the past and influences, but we are moving forward into our sort of own things now. So there's no turning back. And I think, in terms of making sense of modern day India, you have to be aware that it's multi-sourced, and it always has been. There's not that many things that are consistent throughout several thousand years of Indian history, but this is one of the rare ones that is. There have always been many sources going all the way back to the Indus Valley civilization. And so can you understand most of modern day India without understanding the broad general period of Indo-Muslim history? No, you can't. You also can't understand much of modern day India without what came before that and what came after that as well. And really, we probably shouldn't just divide. We shouldn't divide it this way to begin with.
Thank you. I thank you, Dr. Trashki. If you want to drop out, you're welcome to, because you said you have a time limitation. I just want to come to Dr. Shamsul Islam now.
Can I just say thank you? Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Dr. Shamsul Islam, broadly, I am a Hindu, and I come from I would say, a fairly liberal family, or at least that's what I believed until 2014 happened, right? And today, I probably have not one person on both sides of my father and my mother who will agree with my views, right? That's a reality for many, many Hindus. I often laugh and tell my Muslim friends, you guys, you think you are a minority? Think about us Hindus, we are a bigger minority than you guys are a minority. And when so many of us Hindus get together and we talk, whether on Facebook or in our WhatsApp conversations, we have a tremendous sense of being a minority in our own setup, in our own families. The one thing that I have heard since I was a kid is that why did not all Muslims go to Pakistan? Now, you did talk about that conference, but I would like you to elaborate a bit more. When Pakistan became a reality in 1946, when it was clear that there will be a Pakistan, what was happening in Muslim households across India? What were people thinking? What were people talking? Was there conversation within Muslim families? Because we also know that there were many Muslim families, many of whom did go to Pakistan. Today, we have families which are, in 1947, and even for many years after that, families got divided between India and Pakistan. Ek bhai chala gaya Pakistan, do bhai ruk gaye Hindustan. So what was happening? Is there any record in history of what was happening in the subcontinental Muslim families?
It is all recorded in subcontinental, especially in the Doaba region, the Ganga Jamna area, Bihar, UP, and other places. There were split in the families. There were fight among organizations, and the kind of repression, the kind of persecution, Muslim National Guards, a gang of gundas established by Muslim League to beat, to kill, to burn mosques, to break heads and arms and limbs of the anti-Pakistanis, leading alims like Madanis and others, Hifzur Rahman, Habibur Rahman, that Harare Islam Erad Islam thing. And Saifuddin Kuchlu, you know, he was almost murdered, and his host, he had gone to Multan to address a meeting, and Muslim League goons attacked, and Kalyan Das, his host, was murdered. And I forgot to mention the murder of Allah Bakhsh by Muslim League goons. Like Gandhi was killed by Hindutva goons. Nobody knows about this. That Allah Bakhsh was murdered by Muslim Leaguers in Shikarpur, Sindh, and it was only after his murder that Sindh could be won by the Muslim League. So, you know, I come from a family where there were split, there were fights, and every house that is a fact. But of course, there were very strong proponents of Pakistan, that Pakistan is for Muslims. But you know how Indian Muslims were ditched by Muslim League, that last few months of the partition politics, he forgot about Indian Muslims. Jinnah openly said that we are not going, we do not want your exodus. We do not want your exodus. So that was a great betrayal. And Muslims who thought that now they would have a park, they would have a holy place to live, those were disappointed.
So I have a follow-up. Sure, Professor Mukhia, please go ahead, sir.
Yeah. Well, you know, I'd like to say that, you know, we are overlooking one very important facet of this whole problematic, namely the role of the state. You see, think of I don't know when Bajpayee went to Lahore. What was the year? I forget. Anyway, the year that he went in a bus to Lahore, right? And he spoke very nicely there. You know, very sweet.
2000,
language.
I think 2000. It was 2000, I believe, 2000.
Whichever year, but anyway, maybe he went to Lahore in a bus and spoke very beautifully there, and you know, won the hearts of the Pakistanis there. You know, right? What was the result of that? I remember there were two cricket matches took place. I think one-day cricket matches, one in Lahore and the other in Mohali in India. And in Lahore, hundreds of Indians went with the Indian flags in the Lahore cricket field and waved these Indian flags, and they were welcomed like long-lost brothers by the Pakistanis. And
free
in
lunches,
Mohali,
free dinners.
And in Lahore, in Mohali, hundreds of Pakistanis came with Pakistani flags, and we were waving these Pakistani flags in the Mohali cricket field, and they were being welcomed by Indians as long lost brothers. You know, what I'm saying then is that Bajpayee ji sent out a message. Look, we want peace with Pakistan. You know, we have had enough of wars and tension and so on and so forth. We want peace with Pakistan. And the message was taken by the people of India and Pakistan, and both became, you know, long lost brothers and found love for each other and affection for each other. All tension was dissolved. You know, comes Modi ji. I mean, it's not a Modi ji has come immediately after that, but I'm just taking these two examples. Modi ji comes, and we are told that, you know, Pakistan is out to destroy India, and the old story, you know, etc., etc. You know, and the same people that you are talking of, who would have probably welcomed these Pakistani flag waving visitors to India, they have now turned against not only Pakistan but against Muslims and so on and so forth. You know, so what I'm saying is that the message which goes out from the state, from the head of the state, is a very important conditioner of people's behavior. You see, and therefore all the language that you are hearing from your family members and friends, etc., it can change tomorrow if the message from the top is changes, you know. And I don't expect Modi ji to send out the change message, but you know, the things change, you know, nothing remains constant, you see. So don't don't place too much of sort of, I mean, it all causes anxiety for us naturally, but let it let it will pass. All of these things come in, just as Bajpayeeji's moderating influence passed. Modiji's strident influence will also pass, you see, and the behavior will change at the social level, you see. These
But
things do happen all the. I'll give you
but
one more example, just so quickly. In
Go ahead.
1989 or 90 or 91, when Advani ji was leading his Rath Yatra and he was going towards Ayodhya, Mulayam Singh Yadav was the chief minister, and he had fortified the Babri Masjid area, and he had said that not a bird should be able to fly into that area, and really not a bird was able to fly, in the sense that the bureaucracy and the police and everything, they were moved to see that no damage can be done, no, not even a person can enter that area, you see. And they ensured, the police and the bureaucracy ensured that no damage is done. 2 years later, in 1992, Kalyan Singh is the chief minister, and the message goes down to the same police and the same bureaucracy: let these people come and demolish the Babri Masjid. And they all went, and the same police and the same bureaucracy helped, not only didn't prevent, but helped these people to reach the Babri Masjid. So that two different messages from the top were followed by the by the police and the bureaucracy. So what the point I'm making is that the state is a very crucial factor, in determining social behavior.
Dr.
Sorry.
Islam, I'll just come back to you. I have now we have time only for the last questions. So I want to
I think, yeah, that's
yeah.
okay.
Professor Mukhia, I just have one last question, and this is a question from Swamiman Samantare. He is asking, what was the role of the Sufi movement and Bhakti movement in shaping the medieval Indian culture?
Okay, it's a great question. Bhakti movement in particular, Islam comes to India with a different concept of God. There is only one God, La ilaha illallah. Hinduism has thousands and millions of gods. In Islam, there is only one form of worship of God, namaz. Hinduism has hundreds of thousands of ways of worshiping God, etc., etc. So the two concepts of God, two modes of worship of God, they stand face to face each other. Nothing in common between them. And therefore, among the followers, there would be a bit of accommodation, bit of tension, bit of violence, and so on and so forth. That naturally occurred. The solution to this was found by Bhakti movement in particular, Sufism also, but Bhakti movement in particular. Among the Sufis, Sheikh Nizamuddin Aulia, particular, and Bakhtiyar Kaki, and so on, the great Chirag Delvi. But among the Bhakti leaders, Kabir in particular, what they did was, they, these two concepts of God and forms of worship of God, alternative forms of worship of God, they had conceived of God as two rival gods, rival entities, my Allah and your Ishwar. I will worship like this, you will worship like this, you and I, they are competing gods, rival gods. Now, Kabir in particular reinterpreted Tawheed, in particular, Tawheed is La ilaha illallah. He reinterpreted it not to mean my Allah and your Ishwar, but one God for all of us, one universal God for us all. Not your God and my God, your Ishwar and my Allah, or my Ishwar and your Allah, but one God for all. You may call it Rahim, you may call him Ram, you may call him Rahim, you may call him nothing, Niranjan, who has no shape. I'm not a Muslim, I'm not a Hindu, I don't go to masjid, I don't perform namaz, I don't perform puja, etc., etc. Or I do both, you see. So, his notion of one universal God, which is not competing gods, but one God, who is universal, who is the God of everyone. They are no longer competing there. Therefore, the tension that should arise between my God and your God, my Allah and your Ishwar, that tension get dissolved. That tensions get dissolved as a result of this. It's a very great concept. Think of it, in Christian world, the same Christians were killing each other all the time. Huge amount of bloodshed amongst the Christians themselves. Different sects of Christian. Here, I mentioned earlier, between Hindus and Muslims for 500 odd years, there was not a single communal tension, communal violence, communal riot in 550 years, or 500 out of 550 years. There was no communal riot. And I very largely attribute to this absence of communal riot to this ideology of one universal God instead of two rival gods. And that was their contribution to, and that's still a contribution. We still sort of revert to Kabir, whenever tension occurs, we still recall Kabir as a balm to cover all this. So yes, it's an enormous contribution, enormous, apart from other things, a conceptual contribution of one universal God instead of two rival gods. So it's huge. I mean, it's a very brief answer to a very fundamental question, but it's a marvelous question, and it's a fantastic contribution of Sufis and Bhakti leaders in particular. Yes, I think that should be. It's 11:30 now. So
yes, just one last question. I have a last question for you, Shamsul Islam Sahab. And Professor Mukhya, just to stay with us for the next 2-3 minutes, if you don't mind, sir.
Okay.
Last question to you, Shamsul Islam Sahab, is, on the day of Bakrid after India's partition and independence in 1947, Maulana Azad spoke from the Jama Masjid. It's a great speech, one of the greatest speeches we have read, we have heard. I just want to quote from the speech, and he says, तुम्हें याद है, and he was speaking to Muslims, and he said, तुम्हें याद है, मैंने तुम्हें पुकारा और तुमने मेरी जबान काट ली, मैंने कलम उठाया और तुमने मेरे हाथ कलम कर दिए, मैंने चलना चाहा तो तुमने मेरे पांव काट दिए, मैंने करवट लेनी चाहिए तो तुमने मेरी कमर तोड़ दी. And he's talking about, he clearly says, अभी कुछ ज्यादा वक्त नहीं बीता जब मैंने तुम्हें कहा था कि दो कौमों का नजरिया मर्ज मौत का दर्जा रखता है, मर्ज मौत का छोड़ दो, जिन पर आपने भरोसा किया वो भरोसा बहुत तेजी से टूट रहा है. And then he talks about the Muslim League. I just want to ask you a very blunt question, and this is not to speak against the state of Pakistan or against the sisters and brothers from Pakistan, but did the creation of Pakistan, what kind of consequences did it have for Muslims who stayed back in India?
Very serious and very dangerous consequences. But Ajit Bhai, you must also understand that when he is talking to Jama Masjid Muslims, he is not blaming them that you did not listen to them. Please be careful. Those Muslims had stayed back. So, this Hindutva thing that, see, even Maulana Azad said that all Muslims supported. He was talking of Muslim leaguers, the Muslim League leadership.
Correct.
And Jinnah, who used to refuse shake hands with him, even call Maulana Abul Kalam Azad. He said, I will not name him. Right? So, and responsibility in partition of Congress and Government of India and Hindu nationalists, and you should never forget that it was 1906 that first time Hindu nationalists gave the theory of two-nation theory that Muslims should go away, Muslims should be sent to Afghanistan. Lala Lajpat Rai, Bhai Parmanand, then Munje and others. And even Lala Hardayal said that all Muslims of India should be शुद्धि के जरिए उनको कर दो, नहीं तो उनको सबको अफगानिस्तान भेजो. ठीक है, तो वो इतना इशू के वो इंडियन में जो मुस्लिम रह गए थे उनको कह रहे थे, वो जरूरी नहीं है. सेकेंडली, मैं आपका जो अभी आपने एक बात कही थी, you find yourself in minority. I will not agree with that of your take.
No.
See, we should, we unfortunately, what is happening, that when Hindutva is being presented as Hinduism, it is one of the questions which I saw in the question answer Q&A thing. We must not forget that Hinduism and Hindutva are two different things. And since there is no time, I will give you only one example. Gandhi was a follower of Hinduism. He was killed by the Hindutva criminals. So that is the difference between Hindutva and Hinduism. And for Hindutva, Muslims are enemies, but Kisan movement, this historic Kisan movement after 1857 is showing that Muslims are not the enemy, but pro-corporate policies of the Modi government, and that also of the two family. And this is just a coincidence, but it is a coincidence that all belong to Gujarat. That kinship, Gujarat has very great kinship, has sense of kinship historically. So that's a funny thing. And Hindutva, what is Hindutva? Hindutva is anti-Muslim, anti-Christian politics for the masses and riches for the corporate. So this is how Hindus are suffering. Hindu women are suffering. That's important. So you are not in minority.
Thank you.
No,
Professor Mukhia,
Kisan are with you. Kisan are with you.
Make concluding remarks, Professor Mukhia.
Yeah, well, before you, I'd like to suggest, if you haven't seen this book by Ishtiaq Ahmed on Jinnah, which was published a few months ago, couple of months ago, I think you should read it. Penguin has published it, just called Jinnah and something. It's a very fat book, 800 pages, by Professor Ishtiaq Ahmed. Wonderful book on Jinnah, and the whole question of partition and so on and so forth. I would strongly recommend it to you. Very
This
detailed.
one you must read this book.
There it is. Yeah, Jinnah. Yeah, please read this. Yes.
Thank you
Okay.
so much. I'll hand it back to Rashid Ahmed Saab.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Ajit. Thank you, Professor Mukhia and Professor Islam. It was fascinating conversation, literally a journey to the past, and then how we came here today when the history is being rewritten literally on 280 characters Twitters. So thank you very much for your contribution, and thank you, Professor Islam, for that articulating the history, Muslims in history and partition, and how the struggles, both Hindus, Muslim, Christian and Sikh communities were all part of the struggle. Thank you very much for that. And as I said earlier, everybody, all three of our esteemed panelists deserve a dedicated session, and maybe that's something in the future we can consider. But with that, thank you everybody, and thank you everybody who joined the webinar.
All the best to your organization and all friends or your teams. And Ajit Bhai, special thanks. Rashid Bhai, special thanks. Huh?
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your time, and we will stay in touch. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you everybody who joined call.